In this presentation, we'll discuss a famous fifth-generation film called Rise the Red Lantern. In order to strengthen the argument we're making, we'll analyze the content and contextualization. Following this, we'll discuss some of the criticism of this film concerning the authenticity of the cultural rituals. By doing so, we'll argue that Rise the Red Lantern breaks away from some of the limitation of Mao-era cinema and uses many creative cinematic techniques. However, director Zhang Yimou's filmmaking approach to traditional culture might be a continuation of right God's spirit of the Cultural Revolution. Firstly, let me briefly introduce the fifth-generation director and the content of the film. The fifth-generation director refers to filmmakers who graduated from the Beijing Film Academy in 1982, and their work are also known as the fifth-generation films. Among these films, Rise the Red Lantern, released in 1991, is considered almost the most famous one. It was adapted from a novel called Wives and Concubines. The story told by this film is in mainland China in the 1920s. The film focuses on the heroine Song Lian, who is a well-educated student entering a feudal family where you need to compete for the lost favor in order to acquire power temporarily. Just as realized by Jacqueline Loeb, Song Lian is forced to accept indoctrination of traditional Confucian culture and is gradually reduced to the embodiment of the feudal order while losing her agents and mental independence. Specifically, this can be seen in a line of the film. When we compare this film with the films made during the Mao era, we find that the typical differences are theme, narrative, and cinematic techniques. We start with an analysis of the theme and narrative, as indicated by Anne, taking Xie Jing's dead sister as an example. The old society in the Mao era film was neither described nor criticized in detail, but used to serve as a foil to promote the new ideology and the advantages of communism. However, as a fifth-generation director, Zhang Yimou somehow freed himself from the politicization which could be widely found in Mao-era films. According to Paul Clark, this may also relate to his experience being sent to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution. To be precise, perhaps the in-person experience of traditional Confucian culture gave him a tendency to think critically about it and therefore use film to criticize it. In terms of cinematic techniques, we'll take Zhang Yimou's color using in Rise the Red Lantern as an example. In Chinese culture, red symbolizes happiness, warmth, and joy. However, as pointed out by Shorten, in this film, red is used as a metaphor for marriage, power, and in association with sex. For example, the ritual of setting a red lantern in front of the wife's room indicates that the master will spend the night with the wife. In this case, the red lantern metaphorically represents a kind of temporary power giving. It is also visualizing an imbalance of power in the marital relationship. Moreover, according to Sun, Zhang Yimou's use of color in this film is artistically exaggerated and used to render an atmosphere to express an emotion, which could be rarely found in Mao-era films. Considering the context, the reason could be that Zhang, as well as other fifth-generation directors, attended the Beijing Film Academy after the reform and opening. Influenced by Western films and individualism, Zhang's cinematic techniques focuses on artistically and intuitively creating emotional experience because cinematic techniques are no longer limited to serving plots and political propaganda. Zhang Yimou's films are free from didactic and boring. As we have discussed, Rise the Red Lantern is a breakthrough from previous Mao-era films. However, it has also met sharp criticism. Much of the criticism has focused on the cultural rituals shown in the film. The many critics have noticed that although these rituals appear to be Chinese, they are fictionalized by Zhang without reference. Admittedly, one might argue that the fictional rituals in this film only serve to represent the community culture visually or audibly in an artistic way. However, according to Shorten, such argument goes against the logic of cultural ethnography research, which is considered a systemic way to understand a culture. Referring to the scholarly definition of cultural ethnographic research, the researcher abstracts and attempts to understand the culture of a community by observing and studying the participants' idea, cultural products, and cultural practices, including rituals. In other words, when Zhang imagines a ritual based on his own knowledge of Confucianism, it gives the audience an inaccurate impression and therefore a biased understanding of Chinese traditional culture. The inaccurate and even imaginary reconstruction of the cultural rituals in this film has also led to the suspicion of Zhang's motives. For example, cultural scholar Dai Qing sharply criticized it as a typical Orientalist work. Dai argues that it close echoes the theme of criticizing patriarchy that are common in the global cinema market, but citing numerous details that are inconsistent with Chinese culture and historical facts. Dai further criticized Zhang for his lack of rigor and knowledge. Also, Dai believed that there were many stereotypical cultural symbols such as the extraordinary huge Peking opera face in the bedroom was used. However, when we return to the context of filmmaking, we may find that these elements of the film that have led to its criticism are reasonable and understandable. As Paul Clark and John Lee have noted, after the establishment of Communist China, with the expectation of a new regime and ideology, the recent history of frequent invasion and underdeveloped economic conditions were attributed to the traditional cultural order. Hostility toward the culture reached its peak at the Cultural Revolution. During this period, more traditional Chinese Confucian culture was violently erased, rather than being archivally preserved or critically studied as a cultural product of the past. Therefore, after the Cultural Revolution, traditional cultural practices, including rituals, have become more difficult to be examined. Thus, attempts to ethnographically reconstruct what happened in the past might be both costly and time-consuming, which would bring many difficulties to the filmmaking. As Sultan criticized rather than critiquing the old society, Zhang Yimou criticized an old society of his imagination. Some of the above criticisms are to some extent admitted in an interview by Zhang Yimou in 1999. Zhang said that the films he made in his early years, including Rust Red Lantern, were the product of strong emotions, and that he did not precisely know what he was rebelling against or criticizing. In contrast to the sixth-generation director's attempt to restore and confront the emotions of experience of marginalized individuals in the city, Zhang Yimou's emotionalism and idealism are more evident in his film, where he tried to critique the old culture all at once with his enthusiasm. A typical aesthetic example of this is the color using and lighting. In contrast to the natural light sought by sixth-generation directors, Zhang Yimou makes extensive use of non-everyday colors such as red in this film. Referring to Paul Clark's analysis, we might consider this oversimplification idealistic or radical of culture to be a continuation of social atmosphere of the Cultural Revolution, which almost covered Zhang Yimou's youth. I could not actually break completely with what Sutton called the red god spirit, but retain an idealistic, even biased attitude towards the traditional culture. However, it is perhaps too harsh to hold the film as an art piece to the standard of ethnography research. Omira embraced fictional rituals in many of Zhang Yimou's films. Although she is fully aware that many of those films have been criticized by some scholars as deceptive. Specifically, Omira argues that such fictional cultural rituals may make it more acceptable for the transcultural audience and provide possibility of a holistic way to show Chinese traditional culture. Omira also believes that using fictional cultural rituals challenges the hegemonic interpretation of Chinese history and culture. In summary, our presentation dialectically develops a contextualized analysis of Zhang Yimou's film, Rust the Red Lantern, briefly introduce the context and content of its production as a fifth-generation director's work, and in the context of Zhang Yimou's personal experience, discuss the film break with the old films of Maoira cinema in terms of theme, narrative, and cinematic techniques. However, concerning some scholars' critics of this film, they point out that Zhang Yimou's imaginary representation of Confucian ritual in this film would be Orientalism and contrary to cultural ethnography. Nevertheless, when returning to the historical context in which the film was made, it is perhaps Zhang Yimou's biographical experience that led him to attempt to critically discuss traditional culture, but also struggles to fully escape the continuation of the social climate brought about by the Cultural Revolution, which led to somewhat radical and idealistic attitude towards traditional culture. Finally, joining on Amira's argument, we suggest that perhaps the fictional culture rituals allows Zhang Yimou's film to challenge historical or cultural hegemony, allowing the audience to view Chinese culture in a cross-cultural context while avoiding homogeneous interpretation.